And welcome to Lessons in Logic number 50. This just keeps going. I've never had a series go this long before. And for the lower right-hand corner of the screen today, I've selected this lovely picture of Devil's Cataract, my favorite part of Victoria Falls. Let's attribute the photo to its taker, Ralph Junghans. And let's now send it to its portion of the screen and talk about informal fallacies. You could think of this as a lesson in how not to do inductive logic. It's maybe a lesson in inductive logic. It's a lesson in evaluating arguments by finding out which fallacies they commit, but also finding out which fallacies they don't commit, because, well, you might find an argument doesn't commit any of these fallacies. And of course, sometimes it'll commit not one, but maybe another. That can happen too. All right, so let's do some introductory remarks on informal fallacies and then talk about the informal fallacies. Validity depends on form, not content, meaning if an argument is valid, which means that it's not possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time, the validity of the argument depends on the way we're reasoning about things, not the things we're reasoning about. So a formal fallacy involves the use of an invalid argument form or an invalid pattern of reasoning, a way of reasoning about things that makes it possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. So spotting a formal fallacy does not require us to know anything about the content of an argument. All we need to know is the form, the pattern of reasoning, the way we're reasoning about things. It doesn't matter what we're reasoning about. That's why when we're doing deductive logic, we look at the pattern of an argument. We find ways of symbolizing the argument so that we can see the pattern directly and ignore the content of the argument. We eventually forget the content of the argument. So if an argument turns out to be a conversion of an A-form proposition in categorical logic, all X or Y, therefore all Y or X, we say that's an invalid argument form, even if we don't know what the X and Y actually are, or something like that. Let's do one for statement logic. If X, then Y, Y, therefore X is affirming the consequent fallacy. And even if we don't know which statement is actually X and which statement is actually Y, we know that it's a bad argument. That's formal fallacies, though. That's deductive logic. That's why we can test for validity or invalidity and prove validity using letters to represent atomic propositions, simple propositions, without even knowing what those propositions are. And we actually did that. But now we're doing inductive logic, so things are different. Strength, unlike validity, depends in large part on content, on the things we're reasoning about, not just on the way we're reasoning about them. So inductive logic, the branch of logic which is concerned with testing arguments for strength, requires us to pay attention to the content of an argument. So an informal fallacy is an error in reasoning that does not involve the explicit use of an invalid form. And many informal fallacies fit the same common patterns, and these patterns have names. But do not believe what they told you about informal fallacies. It was probably false. Probably 90% of what's on the internet about informal fallacies is not true, because these are not actually the names of fallacies as such. Let me state this as carefully as I know how. The names of informal fallacies are not the names of argument forms that are inherently fallacious. Rather, they are the names of argument forms that are often used in a fallacious way. Maybe I can phrase that more precisely. That wasn't quite right, was it? The names of informal fallacies, the names we use when we talk about informal fallacies are not actually names of argument forms that are inherently fallacious. There's no such thing as an argument form that's inherently fallacious in inductive logic. That's a thing for deductive logic. Every pattern of reasoning, every way of reasoning about things that you can determine to be fallacious using inductive logic is a pattern that probably has at least one non-fallacious argument to it, because you can only know that it's fallacious by paying attention not only to the pattern, not only to the way we're reasoning about things, but also to the things we're reasoning about, content, not just form. So the names we use when we talk about informal fallacies are not the names of argument forms that are inherently fallacious, argument patterns. They are the names of argument patterns that are often used in a fallacious way. And I think if you want to get technical, the best way of using the word fallacy or informal fallacy would be to refer to specific arguments. This argument is an informal fallacy. That argument is an informal fallacy. Those three arguments over there, or those three arguments in that book over there, or those three arguments in the news article you read that was written by some goofball who'd never taken a decent logic class. Those three arguments were fallacious. And maybe not even use these names to refer to groups, to categories of arguments, but it's close enough. We'll do it this way. We are using names like ad hominem fallacy, ad populum fallacy. Let's just scroll down because my brain's freezing. Appeal to pity, appeal to emotion, strawman fallacy, appeal to force. All of these are names of argument patterns that are often used in a fallacious way. But not every ad hominem attack is necessarily fallacious. Not every appeal to force is fallacious. Not every appeal to pity is fallacious, etc., etc. Most of these patterns are used by some good arguments, arguments that are strong or cogent, maybe even valid. So what's important to know here is that these are patterns that are often used fallaciously, and what's important to be able to do is use good judgment on arguments that have these patterns to recognize the ones that are fallacious, but not go making false accusations of fallacy just because an argument is an attack on a person or an appeal to authority or an appeal to pity. Some arguments do attack a person or appeal to authority or appeal to pity without being fallacious. It does happen. I'll try to give you as many examples as is necessary to demonstrate this. But these are patterns that are often used in bad arguments, particularly weak inductive arguments. So it's very important to be able to recognize them. Now, before we even get to any of them, let's observe that there are different ways of classifying the informal fallacies. There's not even an official list. Different logic textbooks will give you different lists. They will give you different systems for categorizing them. There's not just one best way to do it. I don't know what I think is the least bad way. In fact, I shouldn't even talk in those terms because all the ways I know of I think are actually quite good. But I don't know which is the best way. If there is such a thing, there probably isn't. There's certainly not one perfect way of doing it. The textbook I'm most influenced by, namely The Power of Logic by Lehman, Wasserman, Howard Snyder, and Howard Snyder. This book groups the informal fallacies into 4 categories. And we'll get names for different patterns of argument from each of these categories, several names per category. And we'll try to go over all of them in one video. Now, let's see, what was I going to say? I was going to say this. This is the thing I forgot to say. I forgot to say there are different systems for categorizing them and different lists of fallacies and sometimes different names of fallacies. It actually happens surprisingly often that who've taught logic at university, I come across someone referring to some fallacy on the internet, and I'm like, what the heck is that? I've never heard of that fallacy. I don't think I've ever seen the no true Scotsman fallacy in a logic textbook or Mott and Bailey, and my brain's freezing about some of the other ones I've encountered on the internet that I didn't see in a logic textbook. Well, there's a good reason for that. There are lots of different argumentative strategies that are frequently used in fallacious ways, and there's no perfect system for naming and categorizing them all. What we have are good systems, and I'm giving you a good system based mainly on that one particular textbook. First category, fallacies of relevance. These are fallacies where the premises of an argument are just not relevant to the conclusion. Second category, defective induction, where the premises are relevant, but they're not good enough at supporting the conclusion. Next, fallacies of presumption. These are fallacies where there's an unwarranted assumption in the premise. The premises of an argument might do a good job supporting the conclusion, but those premises are not appropriate because they make inappropriate assumptions. Better to understand this by example, but we'll scroll down to get an example. Fallacies of ambiguity. These are arguments where the conclusion uses words or phrases in certain ways that were used in different ways in the premise. Those are fun. We'll get to that shortly, or not too shortly. Fallacies of relevance. Let's jump into it. Let's look at some fallacies of relevance. We want to look at 1, 2, 7 fallacies of relevance, but we'll look at a couple variations of some of them. First, appeal to the populace or appeal to the people. And a lot of these fallacies have Latin names, or a lot of these categories of arguments that are, these patterns of reasoning that are often used in fallacious ways. A lot of them have names that were given to them by Latin logicians, and when I have enough presence of mind, I'll mention them. The Latin name for appeal to the populace is ad populum. Appeal to the people or appeal to the populace, the ad populum fallacy, is trying to persuade by appealing to our desire to be part of the group, or appealing to our desire to just agree with everyone. Let's check Exodus 23:2, which is a nice Bible verse on the subject. I prefer the ESV, but let's not check it yet. Let's first do this one. I think because of whatever aspects of my personality are relevant here, I'm very minimally vulnerable to an appeal to the people fallacy. I remember when I'm riding the bus to school, and everyone on the, for some reason, we're talking about the movie Rush Hour, starring Jackie Chan and someone. And everyone on the bus was saying it was Chris Rock. And I was like, no, I'm pretty sure it's not Chris Rock. But I can't remember who it actually is who starred in Rush Hour alongside Jackie Chan. And they even took a vote. Who thinks it's Chris Rock? And everybody voted against me, or at least a very strong majority. I think it was everyone. And they said, well, Boone, now what do you think? And I think I'd previously, if I remember correctly, I'd previously given an estimate. Oh, I'm about 98% sure. It's not Chris Rock who's in this movie. I can't remember who it is, but the co-star alongside Jackie Chan in the movie Rush Hour is not Chris Rock. It's someone else. So they all took a vote, and then they asked me, now how sure are you? And I said, yeah, same, about 98%. If I remember correctly, there was some reaction that in retrospect is kind of amusing, like, oh my goodness, like, we'll never convince this guy or something. And it wasn't until days later when I woke up from a nap and said, I think it was Chris Tucker. And you can check the internet if you have your doubts, but I'm pretty sure that is the exact name. And he's totally not the same guy as Chris Rock. Chris Tucker, not Chris Rock, starred in Rush Hour. And I resisted the appeal to a majority vote when there was no good evidence here. Now, a majority vote is not always bad evidence. Let's go to the Exodus 23:2 passage, and then we'll go to an example of a maybe one other example of a fallacy, of an appeal to the people fallacy, and one example of an argument that uses the same pattern that's not fallacious. I prefer the ESV. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. It doesn't have the same clarity as what's in my head. What's in my head is, do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. So if that's in my head, there we go. If that's in my head, it probably came from NIV 84. Well, the second sentence here in this translation, when you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. Well, that's a good one. But just this sentence is perfect. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. So I don't know the original Hebrew, but those are good translations. And they're both telling us, don't join in with this fallacy. Don't follow the crowd to think something wrong or to do something wrong. So what's a good example of an ad populum fallacy besides my silly little memory from high school? Oh, here's a great one. This one actually comes from television. He's that guy who was on MSNBC. Maybe he still is. Chris Matthews. Am I remembering the name correctly? Chris Matthews, I think, is the name. He, I think, once made an ad populum fallacy saying most Americans, like Obama, are Keynesians. Most Americans agree with Keynesian economics. And I can't remember the other things he said, but there were some explicit or implicit claim that you should agree with most Americans. You should agree with Obama because Obama agrees with most Americans in supporting Keynesian economics. And I'm thinking that's just an appeal to the people fallacy. Like, who cares if the majority of Americans support Keynesian economics? What matters is Keynesian economics right? Is it a better economic theory than Milton Friedman's economics or something like that? However, an appeal to the people fallacy, an appeal to the people argument is not always bad. You can work in a very simple one just by looking at electoral politics. The people prefer by a 3-to-1 majority a particular policy as demonstrated by a particular election. Therefore, that policy is, let's rephrase. The people prefer that a certain policy be enacted in a democratic republic as demonstrated by their 3-to-1 vote in favor of this policy in an election. Therefore, this is the policy that the democratic republic system of government here, democratically Republican system of government here, ought to enact. Some argument along those lines, where you're explicitly looking at the policy preferences of the majority when policy is explicitly determined by the majority through democratic means. It's very difficult to get an appeal to the people fallacy out of that. Well, it's difficult to find real life examples because they're not that hard. Sorry, they're not that common, but it's not difficult to think of an example. It's an unusual example maybe in real life, but it does happen. The people might, actually, maybe it's not hard at all. Maybe the people by majority vote support bad policy all the time, but within certain parameters where the people have the authority through the democratic process to support a particular thing, when they do so, that being the correct policy, since the correctness of the policy is determined by the vote, would not seem to be an appeal to the people fallacy. To state that that's the correct policy would not seem to be an appeal to people fallacy, but it is easy to think of an example where a democratic majority could vote in a truly evil policy. Like what if the people vote by a 3-to-1 majority to kill all the Jews or something? I believe Hitler came to power through a democratic election. So, it is possible. It is possible. So you always have to look at the content. Maybe I should have put in more content. So let me try to give a more detailed example with a little more content. The people prefer a tax rate of 17.9% instead of a tax rate of 17.3% for people in such and such an income tax bracket, as determined by their voting by a 3-to-1 majority in the election for this policy, and therefore the government should institute that policy. That's an appeal to the people, but it's not fallacious as far as I can tell. All right. Appeal to emotion is trying to persuade by appealing to emotions. Pretty straightforward. A common version of this is the appeal to pity. This one has a Latin name, ad misericordiam. I hope I'm getting that right. Ad misericordiam. I don't think I'm missing any syllables. Let's check my spelling. The internet agrees with me. Ad misericordiam is the appeal to pity version of the appeal to emotion fallacy, promoting a conclusion by evoking pity. The classic example of this is the person who says in court, the murderer who says in court, the person who killed his parents who says in court, please have mercy on me because I'm an orphan. Now, I've heard this one before, or maybe not this one specifically, but I've heard similar things before. Professor, please give me a better grade so I don't lose my scholarship. Or, Your Honor, the defendant may be guilty, but hasn't he suffered enough already? Now, in some cases, the defendant may be guilty, but has probably suffered enough already. Might actually be a pretty good argument, particularly if the suffering if the suffering involves time in prison while you're waiting for a final verdict in court, and it was a pretty minor crime. There are situations where this may not be a fallacious argument, but you sure don't want to make an argument like the defendant may be guilty, but hasn't he suffered enough already when he suffered from hemorrhoid problems and he's a murderer of 12 people. Not a good argument. Usually an argument with this specific pattern is going to be an appeal to pity fallacy. But pity is not always irrelevant to the conclusion. It is irrelevant when Socrates says in Plato's Apology, I'm not going to appeal to your emotions of pity and say, look, I'm a family man, therefore you shouldn't rule me not guilty. Don't say I'm innocent just because I have kids. People come to court and say that. I'm not going to do that because that's a bad argument. I don't believe in bad arguments. I'm freaking Socrates, says Socrates. But an appeal to pity might actually be relevant to the conclusion. Like, if pity is the conclusion, pity might be a really good premise. If the conclusion is you, who have some means to help, really should think about helping these people who are starving in this situation, or these flood victims or whatever, when you are not in any debt and you're spending something like $5 to $20 US every day on frivolities, video games and fancy coffees or something, you should donate something to help these poor people who are suffering in this way. And if the premise also includes some pity, like, look at this picture of these suffering people and be moved by it and donate. That's maybe a fallacious way of arguing sometimes, depending on the details, but I don't think that's fallacious at all in some circumstances. I do think it matters whether the money's being spent well. I mean, any number of charlatans or honest but poorly managed organizations might collect money and appeal to pity for you to donate out of pity, and then they go and misuse the money or they just steal it. It does happen. You want to be sure you're donating to the right organization that's going to use the money well, but an appeal to pity is not always fallacious, particularly when pity is relevant because it's part of the conclusion. If it's relevant to the conclusion because the conclusion is pity and the premise is pity, I don't see why that would be a fallacy of relevance. Let's go to same chapter. In fact, the very next verse. You shall not be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. The words in my head, probably from the NIV 84, is do not show favoritism to a poor man in court, or something like that. Maybe I don't have the words in my head, just something kind of similar. Well, now I've lost my oh, it got filled up half the screen there. Okay, so do not favor a poor man in court. Maybe those are the words from the NIV 84. And that is an explicit biblical command under Torah law to not commit the appeal to pity fallacy in court, or not fall for the appeal to pity fallacy in courtroom settings. Following on, do not follow the crowd in doing evil. But it's also important to not favor the rich in court either. So Exodus 23:6 helps to keep the context in mind. Do not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Do not favor a poor person in court because he's poor. Do not disfavor him because he's poor, because some rich guy is on the other side. If a poor guy robs a rich guy just because one guy's poor and the other guy is rich, don't say not guilty when the poor guy's accused if he's actually guilty because he's poor. But of course, if the rich guy's the jerk, and more to the point, if the rich guy is on trial for breaking a law and some poor person is suffering, don't pervert the justice due to the poor when the rich guy might favor you if you decide in his favor. Don't be corrupt. Also, don't be corrupt out of pity. Leviticus 19:15 is a nice verse, which according to my notes will cover both aspects of this neutral justice principle. So let's see what it says. ESV translation, you shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So there you go. In Plato and Torah and other cool sources, we have nice instruction to avoid the informal fallacies. Red herring is a fallacy that reaches a conclusion by subtly changing the subject. Now, I may not be able to give you a good example of a red herring. Let me see. Let me refill my tea and pause the recording while I try to think through this. All right, refilled my tea, and I think I'll use this example of a red herring fallacy from a ridiculous play I saw many years ago. The play was called 110 in the Shade. There's a guy who claims he can control the weather or some such. He can make it rain. Calls himself Starbuck. Basically, he's a traveling charlatan. And he's trying to convince the townspeople to give him some money so that he can fix their weather or something. And he says, I've done this and helped all the other people in all these other towns. And he's appealing to his track record. And the people ask him, which other towns? Name a town where you've done this service. And he says, why have they named the last town Starbuck after me? Because his name is Starbuck. I think this is a red herring fallacy. You know, the point was, name the town so we can confirm your story, dude. And the charlatan's reply is, oh yeah, they named the town after me. That's the name of the town. The town's got my name. And if you're the right sort of rhetorician, if you're the right sort of effective, charismatic charlatan or politician, which is frequently, the same thing. There's a lot of overlap in the Venn diagrams there. You can make that work rhetorically, but it's just a fallacy. And I think we would classify that as a red herring fallacy. All right. Now, actually, maybe I shouldn't say that every pattern we're talking about here, every argument pattern is used by some good arguments. Maybe I should say only most, which is conveniently what's written in my notes. I think I said orally all, but it's the notes say most. So I'm not sure if I could name an argument that is fallacious. I'm not sure I could find any example of an argument that's fallacious that has the same pattern here, because the pattern we're describing here is almost inherently fallacious. Reaching a conclusion by subtly changing the subject. I don't think you can reach a conclusion by subtly changing the subject without committing a fallacy. So in some cases where the failure of the premises to provide good support to the conclusion is written into the description of the argument pattern, maybe there's no exception. On the other hand, actually, you might be able to subtly change the subject and still get the same conclusion as long as the new subject is relevant. Like, what if I'm making some argument about, I don't know, the national debt. The American national debt is just disastrously large. What if I'm arguing about the national debt and I say, oh, it's because of these policies? For example, let's talk about the way the Social Security program is structured. And we didn't listen to Paul Ryan for all those years. So we have this massive debt problem, and you can't fix it without fixing Social Security. I'm going to have some sort of objection, and then perhaps merely out of the finitude of my own mind, I respond to the objection by saying, well, let's talk about this other program, this other federal welfare program that's poorly structured, and we didn't listen to Paul Ryan. And that's going to continue to cause massive debt problems until we reorganize this program. And I'm changing the subject from the objection. The objection was to what was the first thing I said about Social Security, and then I subtly changed the subject to something else. But the new topic is still totally relevant to the conclusion. So actually, if I'm subtly changing the subject within certain parameters, but still giving information relevant to the conclusion, probably a red herring argument is not necessarily fallacious. All right, straw man fallacy attacks a misrepresentation of the opponent's position. Now that's one where I'm not even going to try to find an example. I don't see how this could ever be a non-fallacious kind of argument. It's built into the description. Attacking a misrepresentation of the opponent's position is a straw man fallacy. Let me see if I can find good examples here. Straw man fallacy. Well, this probably happens in politics all the time. At the moment, it's August of 2022. I think a lot of people who critique people who still have concerns about the 2020 election are attacking misrepresentation of their positions. Like, their position might be, well, the Hunter Biden laptop story was squashed by big tech giants, and according to some sources, this was done with at the instigation of the FBI. And then they had a lot of rule changes, and some of the rule changes were pretty obviously illegal at the time, and sometimes it's been verified in court. Look up Teagan versus Wisconsin Elections Commission to find a big problem with the 2020 election that affected more votes that were apparently counted illegally in the state of Wisconsin than the Biden margin of victory. So some people have legitimate concerns about these things, which in some cases are verified in court or by other means. And some people might be attacking people who are concerned about the 2020 election with some sort of misrepresentation of their position, like maybe their position has nothing to do with allegations of hacked voting machines, or position as to whether January 6th was an appropriate action or anything like that, but they have legitimate concerns about some illegality that was involved in some aspect of the 2020 election, and they get attacked as people who have some much stronger view than they in fact have. That might be a good example of a straw man fallacy. I sure didn't want to talk about this when I started the video, but I don't know. I think I'm keeping it. I think I like that. It's a good example, and I think it happens a lot these days. In fact, I think the whole election denier term is probably all straw man fallacy. I don't think anyone's denying elections. Let's see. Argument against the person ad hominem fallacy. Okay, this is a fun one. Attacking the person making an argument instead of attacking the actual argument. There are some different varieties of ad hominem fallacies. Abusive ad hominem is a direct personal attack, something like a simple insult. Circumstantial ad hominem fallacy is trying to discredit by calling attention to the opponent's circumstances. The tu quoque ad hominem fallacy is a version of circumstantial where you're charging your opponent with hypocrisy or inconsistency. Now, I'm not going to be very thorough here, but let me give a few examples. Let's note that even if it doesn't have a name, the fallacy that's not attacking the other person but praising you in such a way as to be irrelevant to your conclusion is also a fallacy. So the shoulder devil gives Kronk both of those fallacies in the Emperor's New Groove. Remember, he says, reason number one, why you should do what I say. This shoulder angel over here has that sissy stringy thing. And the angel's like, we've been through this, it's a harp. So reason number one, the guy telling you to do what's right, the guy trying to lead you down the path of righteousness, that guy has a sissy stringy thing, therefore you should ignore him. That's clearly a circumstantial ad hominem attack, trying to discredit the angel's position by calling attention to his circumstances. He's holding a sissy stringy thingy and wearing a dress. The angel says robe, but the devil says it's a dress, not a harp. Or it's a dress, not a robe. Let me pause and go over it. Kronk's like, my shoulder angel, and then the shoulder devil shows up and my shoulder angel, shoulder devil shows up, and the shoulder devil says, don't listen to that guy. He's trying to lead you down the path of righteousness. I'm going to lead you down the path that rocks. And he says, listen up, buddy. I've got a few reasons why you should do what I say. Reason number one, the angel over there has that sissy stringy thing. Angel's like, we've been through this. It's a harp. And the devil's like, yeah, and that's a dress. And the angel's like, robe. Anyway, the argument that you should ignore what the angel says because he's got a sissy stringy thingy and apparently he's wearing a dress, that is an ad hominem, a circumstantial ad hominem attack on the angel's position that Kronk should do what is right. And then the devil says, reason number two, look what I can do. And then he does some fancy acrobatic thing. He does a single handstand or something. And Kronk doesn't explain why this is a fallacy. He doesn't say, look, your ability to do cool acrobatics is not relevant to the truth of your conclusion that I should do what's evil in this situation. But Kronk does say, look, you guys are confusing me, so be gone, or however I get rid of you guys. And he's correct to be confused, even if he didn't call out the fallacy explicitly, because that's a terrible argument. That's saying, I'm awesome and therefore you should agree with me. Now, if I say to you, I have spent years studying Augustine, therefore you should listen to my opinions about Augustine. That's not a fallacy. I actually have spent years studying Augustine. But in general, saying I'm awesome, I'm cool, or something like that is a fallacious argument. I'm awesome, I'm cool, therefore agree with me. That's a terrible argument in most cases. And so is this guy's a loser, therefore disagree with him. Don't call attention to the opponent's circumstances to discredit his argument. And don't just make an insult and call it an argument. Joe Biden is stupid, therefore his policies are bad. Well, you know, some politicians are stupid. Anyway, that doesn't matter. What matters is, are his policies bad? You don't criticize Biden's policies by saying they're stupid. Sorry, by saying he's stupid. If you can argue that the policies themselves are stupid, well, you might have a fine argument. Okay, so let me give an example of an ad hominem argument that's not a fallacy. Adolf Hitler is a genocidal maniac. Therefore, his moral positions don't need to be taken very seriously. Now, this is an argument you're not really going to need very often. Not a lot of people are going to appeal to the moral positions of Adolf Hitler. But you might try this with Che Guevara. Like someone out there on the internet this very day is quoting Che Guevara on some question of morality and maybe appealing to Che's authority. Maybe Che said something very eloquent, and maybe there's an important point there. Maybe Che actually gave an argument with premise and conclusion, in which case, look at the premise, look at the conclusion. But if it's just a quote saying, here's an interesting guy who said this thing that sounds important about what's right or what's wrong, I don't think it's a fallacy to say, Che Guevara is a mass murderer, so why should I care about his position on ethics? I don't see how that's a fallacy at all, any more than it's a fallacy to say Adolf Hitler's a genocidal maniac, therefore we don't need to take very seriously his moral positions. All that aside, if there's an actual argument from Shea or even from Hitler, it's better to refute the argument itself and not just attack the person. But not every attack on the person is a fallacy as such. Appeal to force, promoting a conclusion by threatening the well-being of those who disagree. This is the classic fallacy of the mobster. How do they say it on the podcast? Nice place you got here. Sure would be a shame if something were to happen to it. Therefore, you better agree with me, or you better do what I want. Well, that's an appeal to force. The Latin term ad baculum. All right. When is this not a fallacy? When the force to be exercised would be exercised legitimately and justly, I don't think it's a fallacy. Like anyone who ever advised anyone, don't break the law because you might get caught and punished. I don't think anyone there was ever committing fallacy, or at least unless there was something else interesting in the argument. That in itself does not even hint of a fallacy. Don't break the law because you might get caught and punished. That's not a fallacy at all. But it is an appeal to force. It's threatening your well-being, or at least warning you of threats to your well-being. That's not fallacious as such. It's fallacious to do it when it's not relevant to the conclusion. Now that I think of it, even if you say don't break the law, you might get caught and punished. Depending on the law, what if it's some law requiring you to report on any Jews in the city when you're in Nazi Germany during World War II? Yeah, you might get caught and punished if you break that law. You should probably break the law anyway. So even that might be fallacious. You have to look at the content of the argument. All right, argument against a position based on a misunderstanding of it. That's the missing the point fallacy. This is basically a straw man fallacy, but accidental. And with that, let's be done with fallacies of relevance. Let's talk about fallacies of defective induction. All right, so these are fallacies where the premises are actually relevant to the conclusion, but they're not strong enough in support of the conclusion. Appeal to ignorance is arguing that a conclusion is false because there's no good evidence for it, or that a conclusion is true because it has not been disproven. Now, we'll probably talk about this in another video, but it's okay in some situations to argue from the absence of evidence. I see no elephants in my office. So there are no elephants in my office today. There's no evidence for elephants, therefore there aren't any elephants. That's a great argument. But it would be a mistake to make that argument if I were talking about spiders. I see no evidence of spiders. That doesn't mean there's no spiders. It'd be very easy for me to not see the spider in my office or any evidence of it. In some situations, it's appropriate to believe something until evidence to the contrary is presented. I have no reason to believe I'm in the matrix, so I'm not. I don't think that's a bad argument. In some situations, we might disagree over whether it's appropriate to argue from the absence of evidence. There is no proof that God exists, so God does not exist, and no one I know has ever met an angel, therefore they don't exist. There are people of different positions on, well, I don't know, maybe not the angel one, but actually probably that one as well. But there's no proof that God exists, so God does not exist. Even if that premise is true, that there's no proof, maybe we should just say no particularly good evidence. Even if it's true that there's no good evidence that God exists, although that is also very much disputed, that doesn't necessarily mean you should believe that God does not exist. And this brings in whole issues in philosophy of religion about divine hiddenness and religious epistemology. William James has interesting arguments that it's entirely appropriate to believe that God exists, even in the absence of evidence. Kant has an argument of his own. So the point is only that this is debated. In some cases, this is a big worldview issue, and you have to carefully study whole other topics in philosophy of religion or epistemology to be sure. But the point here is appeal to ignorance is frequently fallacious, as when I say there's no spiders in my office because I have no evidence of them, but not always fallacious. I see no elephants or any evidence of elephants, so there are no elephants here. You have to look at the content to be sure. Our textbook, the usual textbook, Power of Logic. The Power of Logic notes that in certain legal systems, a person is considered innocent until proven guilty. So in other words, you're supposed to accept provisionally an argument from ignorance. No guilt if no convincing evidence of guilt. We'll probably do another video on appeal to ignorance later. Let's talk about appeal to unreliable authority. Now, if you ever encounter this as the appeal to authority, I think that's not a good name, although it does turn up in the Latin name ad veracundum. It's better to think of this as an appeal to unreliable authority. What's fallacious is drawing a conclusion from an authority without expertise. If a person has no special knowledge of the subject in question, appealing to that person's authority is a fallacy. As I recall, in the year 2004, some reporter asked Tom Cruise if he was voting for George W. Bush or John Kerry. And I think Cruise's response was, "It's not your business," or "Why do you care?" or something like that. Because it really isn't anyone's business whom Tom Cruise is voting for. Is he an expert in economics or political science or ethics in general or anything else relevant? Is he an expert in history, for example? Anything relevant to whom you should vote for president? Not really. He's done some cool movies. He does very respectable stunts in his movies. There are good things you could say about Tom Cruise for sure, but none of it is that he's an expert in anything telling us whom to vote for president. Any celebrity endorsement of a political candidate is going to be fallacious if it's just, "I support this person, so should you." But if the celebrity gives an argument, then you need to deal with the argument on its own terms. If a celebrity says you should vote for this candidate because such and such, then, well, pay attention to whether the argument is any good. If Michael Jordan endorses a particular type of underwear or shoes or something, and he gives arguments, take the argument seriously. If he's just appealing to his own celebrity and authority, "I'm awesome, I buy this product, you should too," well, that's not a very good argument. Although in the case of Nike shoes, at any rate, if he's done amazing basketball while wearing them, he might actually be an expert in that particular topic. So be careful. Not every appeal to authority is fallacious. So here's a good argument. My history teacher says that Jerusalem fell in 587 BC. So that's when Jerusalem fell. That's a pretty good argument. History teacher ought to know that sort of thing. I hope I have the right year here. Off the top of my head, I would say that's probably right for the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians. But don't quote me on that. My brain's getting another number, 387. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry, I can't remember the year. Anyway, it's not a bad argument, whether the history teacher is correct. If you're appealing to the authority of a history teacher, that's pretty good. Celebrity endorsements of political candidates, usually a bad one. The Pope says that Catholic teaching condemns abortion, so it does. Well, that's a good argument. Doctor tells me that smoking weed kills brain cells, so it probably does. That's a good argument. A doctor is an expert in that sort of thing. Doctor tells you that smoking weed is wrong. Well, I think you have to ask whether doing something that kills brain cells is necessarily wrong, or whether a doctor has any expertise in morality. And if it's that smoking weed kills brain cells and killing brain cells is wrong, and the doctor just left out the premise that it's wrong, and said it's wrong because it kills brain cells and didn't spell out that other premise and should have spelled it out, then, well, maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's a case where you need to do logic and find the unstated premise. It looks like an enthymeme. It's an argument with an unstated premise. Examine it accordingly. But if it's some worldview issue, whether doctors have any expertise in morality, well, on an Aristotelian ethics, maybe so, but not on a lot of other ethics, a lot of other theories in ethics. And what sort of authority does the Pope have? That, again, seems to be some sort of worldview issue. The Pope says abortion is wrong, therefore it is. The Pope certainly would have expertise in what Catholic teaching says. Does the Pope also have expertise in what actually is wrong? Or maybe we might ask, is Catholic teaching correct? Some atheists might optimistically say, yeah, Catholics are pretty good. Protestants might also say that. Catholics, or at any rate, sensible, good Catholics, assuming we're also dealing with a good Pope, would surely say, well, yes, of course. And some Protestants might say no. And many atheists would say no. This is the sort of thing, in other words, this is the sort of argument, in other words, that you can't just evaluate by saying it's an appeal to authority, therefore it's bad. No, you have to do some analysis. You have to make sure we know who is a good authority on what topics. You have to do some real careful studying in some other area. In this case, Well, in this case, moral philosophy, I suppose. And in this case, I don't know, religion, moral philosophy, maybe both. Let's go to false cause fallacy. This is just arguing that one thing is the cause of another without sufficient reason. You want to give a little more detail, like post hoc ergo propter hoc, reasoning that one event is the result of another just because it came after it. Well, then you can find ones where it's not necessarily fallacious. Okay, so the rooster crowed and then the sun rose. Therefore, the rooster caused the sun to rise. That's a fallacious argument. Gross domestic product grew dramatically in the third quarter of 2003, shortly after the George W. Bush tax cuts. Therefore, tax cuts cause increase in GDP. Well, I'm not sure if that's a great argument. I wouldn't call it a fallacy. It's at least suggestive, but you want some more data. But if you can give an argument like that that shows that all else being equal, dramatic increases in GDP do tend to follow dramatic increases in GDP, gross domestic product, do tend to follow in many cases where other circumstances vary, but there's still a consistent following of increased GDP on tax cuts. You might be able to conclude that tax cuts do cause increase in GDP. Not every kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc style argument is fallacious, in other words, but be careful. Correlation and causality are not the same thing, and one does not necessarily indicate the other, but it may indicate the other. I drank a lot of strong caffeine and then I was less tired, therefore the caffeine caused me to be less tired. Not a bad argument. The slippery slope fallacy is, at least in some textbooks, as in The Power of Logic, classified as a version of false cause fallacy. You might not see them all classified this way in different systems. I would imagine you could go on the internet and spend literally seconds on Google finding a list of fallacies that has slippery slope classified as its own fallacy and maybe merges false cause with post hoc ergo propter hoc. That's fine. There's no perfect system for classifying these things. Anyway, the slippery slope fallacy is arguing that one change will lead to another change, which will lead to other changes, and ultimately to a very bad result. Now, this is not always a fallacy. Here's a version of a slippery slope fallacy. Dilbert's boss says in one Dilbert cartoon, if we start relaxing the rules around the workplace, pretty soon murder will be legal. Murder will be legal soon if we start relaxing the rules about, I don't know, how many pages you get in the shared printer or something. Start relaxing the rules around the workplace, and pretty soon murder will be legal. That's a slippery slope fallacy and a superb example of one from Dilbert's pointy-haired boss. All right, let's see. What's a slippery slope fallacy that's not one? Let me just give a super simple one. Here's a slippery slope fallacy. While hiking in Hong Kong during a heavy rain on a steep hill, you should be extremely careful not to slip, because if you slip at one point, you are likely to slide down the steep hill to another point and possibly keep going to a still other point until eventually, possibly with a sprained ankle or a broken arm, or at any rate, a lot of mud in your face, you come to a stop, or possibly you plummet off a cliff and die. Depending on where you're actually at, how steep the slope is and how slippery it is, this could be a perfect argument. And, watch it with the hiking in the rain, because sometimes the slopes really are slippery, literally, but also figuratively. Some changes do lead to other changes for sure. Let's see. Hasty generalization, arguing that all the members of a class have a certain characteristic just because one or a few members of the class do. Let's see. If you make some conclusion about, this is a good one. Some conclusion about how New Yorkers are, just because of the way this one New Yorker you met once acted, is probably a hasty generalization. Now, on the other hand, it is possible to make conclusions about all members of a class based on one or a few. We do this in science all the time. There's the class of falling objects in the vicinity of Earth. we've observed that they sure do tend to fall towards the center of the earth. In fact, I think we've never seen a falling object in the vicinity of Earth that doesn't fall towards the center of the Earth until it's stopped by something. Unobstructed falling objects proceed toward the center of the Earth when they're falling in the vicinity of the Earth. That's what we see and experience. But there are billions, trillions of falling objects. I mean, you want to count every individual raindrop in all history? There are gazillions. Here's a word from Dilbert, frugal pupillions. There are frugal pupillions of falling objects that we've never observed. We're reasoning about all of them based on just a few, based on a really tiny subset, the ones we've observed. That's not bad reasoning. That's pretty good reasoning. We observed enough to make a conclusion about all falling objects. So it has the same pattern as a hasty generalization fallacy, or more precisely, since any one argument has lots of patterns, the more specific pattern and the more general pattern, remember? Premise, premise, conclusion is the pattern of every argument with two premises. Premise, therefore conclusion, is the pattern of every argument with one premise. But there are also lots more detailed patterns. So some of the patterns of non-fallacious arguments do overlap, or are the same patterns as fallacious arguments. And you have to look really carefully at the content of an argument in the case of inductive logic to confirm that something is a hasty generalization. Next category, fallacies. Fallacies of presumption. Accident is arguing from a generalization to individual cases which the generalization does not cover. I think this is going to be an example from some writings of Alvin Plantinga here. I'm going to modify it a bit. If a majority of people from some particular country are not really good runners, you cannot conclude that some particular person from that country is not a really good runner. When that person happens to be an Olympic athlete, it's probably not a great example. Let me see. Probably some majority of Americans have seen at least one Star Wars film. Most Americans have seen a Star Wars film, therefore Mark has seen a Star Wars film. That doesn't look fallacious to me if you're talking about me. Of course I've seen a Star Wars film. I talk about it on YouTube from time to time. But let's see. If the argument were about someone else, maybe some American who's just immigrated to America and just achieved citizenship and hasn't really learned much English yet, it would be not at all surprising if that person has not seen a Star Wars film, particularly if that person is from a society where maybe we don't have a translation of the Star Wars film available. I mean, there's Chinese Star Wars films. We've translated these things into a lot of languages, but is there an indebelly version of Star Wars? Probably not. There are some languages that don't have any kind of Star Wars in them. So it's still not a great example. I don't like it much. I need a better example. All right, I totally got it. Most politicians are corrupt. Therefore, George Washington is corrupt. You could make a generalization about politicians. Probably a strong majority of them are indeed corrupt. But that's not a rule that covers all cases. All right, complex question or loaded question. This is inserting an unwarranted claim into a question. This is a slightly different definition from some textbooks, but we're not using a textbook. I'll just take that out. I've already told you there's no one perfect set. There's no one perfect list of the fallacies and the definitions of them. The loaded question or complex question inserts an unwarranted claim. The classic example is, are you still beating your wife? You can't say yes if you're not beating your wife. And you can't say no either, because that admits to having beaten your wife in the past. Now, the argumentative strategy is generally unfair, but it is okay to use it. They say it's used legitimately in the courtroom to trick a witness into giving something away. They did this in the movie Legally Blonde. But let me give my own personal example. I did this to my kid, I think 2 days ago. I said, why did you pour all this dish soap into this bowl? And she said, because blah, blah, blah. Actually, she was trying to help. It was adorable. There were dishes to wash, and she wanted to help with the dishes or something, so she put too much dish soap in the bowl where the dishcloth lives. So much dish soap, it was ridiculous. It was way too much dish soap. I had to tell her to stop doing it. But she's 3, 4. What year is it? She's 4, and I tell her, I ask her, why did you pour the soap into the bowl? Because I'm pretty sure she did it. But I hadn't confirmed that she did it until I asked her. I was assuming the proposition that she did it. In my question, why did you do it? And she answered and gave herself away. And I don't think that was wrong. I don't think that was a fallacy. I think it was a perfectly legitimate assumption. It was not a very well warranted assumption. She was the most likely candidate. But I figure if it wasn't true, even if she did answer in some way as to logically concede the claim by accident, I would have been able to follow up and confirm. I don't think I would have been careless or unkind enough to confirm, but she did have a pretty direct, straightforward confession. I extracted the truth by making a complex, loaded question, but I don't think it was an inappropriate case. Maybe when you phrase it this way, it's not as clear that you have to look at the content of the argument. Maybe we should say an established claim. An unestablished claim inserted into a question or presumed by a question makes a fallacious argument sometimes, but not always. If you're pretty sure someone does beat his wife and you need him to confess it, it might be okay to ask, are you still beating his wife? Are you still beating your wife? And see if he carelessly denies that he's still doing it, but thereby confesses that he's been doing it. This might be inappropriate. Even this classic example might be an appropriate situation, an appropriate question, inserting an unestablished claim, including an unestablished claim in some circumstances. All right, begging the question. This terminology is misused all the time. It might be appropriate to just abandon it and just use the phrase arguing in a circle, which is perfectly acceptable and covers most of what we need to. But begging the question is making an argument that assumes the truth of what the argument is trying to establish. People usually say begging the question when they mean, or begs the question when they mean inspires us to ask the question or something like that. Reminds us that this is an important question. Well, sure, but that's not what begs the question means. Begs the question means assumes what is not yet established. Now, a valid argument, though, can commit this informal fallacy. Some will say all of them do. Alvin Plantinga says either God exists or 7 + 5 = 90. 7 + 5 does not equal 90, therefore God exists. Now, this is not his main argument. Plantinga just plays around with this to make a point about something or other in some of his writings. But it is technically a valid argument. The premises guarantee the conclusion. And it sure looks like an informal fallacy. That premise is assuming God exists because 7 + 5 does not equal 90. Now, let me think if I can think of an example where I wouldn't want to classify this as an informal fallacy. I can't think of a good example. This might be one of those where the fallaciousness of arguments using this pattern is written into the description of the pattern, unlike appeal to authority. Although when we say appeal to unreliable authority, maybe we have written it in. Appeal to authority, not necessarily fallacious. Appeal to unreliable authority, sure. Call it fallacious. Let's go to fallacies of ambiguity and wrap up this overly long video. Fallacies of ambiguity. Equivocation is using an ambiguous word or phrase in an argument in which all the words or phrases have to be used consistently throughout. All animals who are rational are men. Women are not men, therefore women are not rational. That looks like a valid argument, but the word men in the first premise is used in the old school, no longer politically correct gender neutral sense, referring to all human beings. Second premise, it refers to adult male human beings, and that makes it a bad argument. We probably talked about this when we were doing categorical logic. And you should, when you find an equivocation, be able to identify the ambiguous word or phrase and explain both of its meanings. Amphibly, this is really fun. It's fun to come up with all sorts of thoroughly ridiculous examples of amphibole. Amphibole means you didn't diagram the sentence properly. Amphibole is drawing a conclusion by misinterpreting ambiguous sentence structure. Your Honor, the witness says that on Saturday morning, just before the accident, she saw two squirrels chasing each other while in a tree. I don't think we have to take very seriously the opinion of someone who spends or weekends in a tree. Now, this might actually be an ad hominem fallacy as well, but the immediate point here is if the witness says she saw on Saturday morning, just before the accident, two squirrels chasing each other while in a tree, obviously she's talking about the squirrels being in the tree and not herself. The conclusion of an equivocation depends on an ambiguous word or phrase. The conclusion of an amphibole depends on ambiguous grammar. In equivocation, some key word or phrase will have more than one possible meaning. In an amphibole, the key word or phrase will normally have only one meaning, like while in a tree only means one thing here. But it's not clear which part of the sentence it modifies. Does it modify she saw while in a tree, or she saw squirrels chasing each other while they were in a tree? That's the question. The person making this argument thinks it modifies she saw it when really it modifies squirrels chasing each other. All right, accent is drawing a conclusion from a premise in which a keyword or phrase appears in both conclusion and premise and means something different because of a shift in emphasis. Now, I think for our purposes, since this is just rudimentary logic instruction on YouTube or Rumble, I'm not going to give you an example. You can forget this one. We have a good list already. Composition, arguing from the nature of parts, the nature of a whole, or from the nature of the members of a group to the nature of a group. And division are basically opposites of each other. And our last two fallacies for this video. Division is arguing from the nature of the whole to the nature of the parts, or from the nature of a group to the nature of the group's members, and composition is going in the opposite direction. Let me find a good example here. Let's see. Hong Kong Baptist University is very important. Mark works for Hong Kong Baptist University, therefore Mark is very important. That's a bad argument, and it's a division argument. Mark weighs more than 50 kilograms. Therefore, Mark's left hand weighs more than 50 kilograms. Bad argument. Division argument. Mark's hand has only 5 fingernails. Therefore, Mark only has 5 fingernails. That's a bad argument. It's composition. Let me see if I can find a more interesting example of one of these. I got an awesome example, and I hope I don't botch the explanation of it. Here's what I think is a composition argument. No individual human being knows how to make a pencil efficiently. Therefore, the whole human race does not know how to make a pencil efficiently. Now, there's a little book called I, Pencil by, I believe the name of the author is Leonard Reed. It's about how no one knows how to make a pencil efficiently, because to make a pencil efficiently, well, there's the making of the raw materials, the wood, and whatever we make pencil lead graphite out of these days, plus the paints, plus whatever this metal is, plus whatever erasers are made out of these days. There's the raw materials, there's the production of the raw materials, the transportation of the raw materials. In the case of the metal, at least, the refining of the raw materials. The wood will have to be cut from a plank, from a tree. All the things have to be transported to a factory and have to be put together properly. And one person is going to know how to grow the tree that the wood is taken from. And one person knows how to get the raw iron ore out of the earth, or whatever kind of metal this is, whatever its constituent elements are. Someone knows how to get that stuff out of the ground or something. Someone knows how to refine it, separate it from its other elements that are mixed up with it. Someone knows how to manage the machine that puts them all together, and then someone else knows how to package them, or how to manage the machine that puts the new pencils in a package. But when you put it all together, you're dealing with hundreds, maybe thousands of different people who are involved in the efficient production of a pencil. And no one knows how the whole process works. Someone like Leonard Read, the author of the book, might have a good understanding of how the process works overall, but he hasn't spent 5 years learning how to grow the trees this wood is taken from. No one is an expert in all stages of the process, so no one knows how to efficiently produce a pencil, but the knowledge exists, spread across the whole set of hundreds or thousands of people who are involved in the efficient production of a pencil. So, let's see. There's one other example I want to check on. Yes, try the same fallacy in reverse. Human beings know how to make this pencil. In general, human beings know how to efficiently produce things that we produce in the modern economy. Pencils, teapots, bags of peanuts, peanut jars, etc. The little remotes that manage these air purifying doohickeys and things like that. The knowledge of how to create these things, not as smartphones, the knowledge of how to create these things efficiently exists. And therefore, one person or one small committee of people can manage an economy efficiently. I think that's a division fallacy. Let's see. Hayek, the economist, and Adam Smith, the economist, give some direct arguments against this sort of thing. But anyway, enough of me dabbling in economics for a moment. Suffice it to say, I think there are some interesting fallacies you could make that illustrate composition and division, talking about economics. And I think there is one composition fallacy that probably a lot of people actually fall for. The knowledge of how to do this stuff efficiently exists. Therefore, it can exist in one person or in one government or in one government committee or in one government agency. No. The knowledge of how to do this economic stuff efficiently is nightmarishly complex. Or maybe I should say gloriously complex. No human mind, shy of the mind of Christ, who has the advantage of being divine, can even have it all in one mind at the same time. It's spread out across lots of different people. Okay, so that's one illustration of what I take to be a composition fallacy. Let me see if I can think of an argument from the nature of parts to the nature of a whole, or vice versa, that's totally not fallacious, because you have to look at the content. The right hand of Mark is partly made of skin cells. Therefore, Mark is partly made of skin cells. That's not a fallacy. Mark weighs less than 300 pounds. Therefore, Mark's right arm weighs less than 300 pounds. That's not a fallacy. As always, look at the content of the argument. Thanks for watching this unduly long video on informal fallacies. We'll do some more next time. We need to zoom in on a couple of these.